Spider-Man The Clone Saga Volume 1 Omnibus is the first in what right now seems to be 4 volumes, followed by Clone Saga Volume 2 and Ben Reilly Volumes 1 and 2. I've never read the Clone Saga before, so having the entire thing collected in 4 omnibuses is great because Marvel have arranged it so it's all in perfect reading order, and of course we get those oversized A4 pages that really show off the art. The front cover uses Mark Bagley's cover art from Amazing Spider-Man 394, and it's not my favourite cover. But on the plus side, it has been recoloured so Gwen's hair is the actual blonde it should be rather than the original cover's silver hair. And the colours in general are a bit more vibrant with better gradation than the original cover. The spine has the Marvel Omnibus logo at the top, which I only noticed recently has changed from the earlier omnibuses which had the lettering in bold and didn't have a square around the Marvel writing. We have in what is my opinion the best Spider-Man logo, this time in red with blue sides. Clone Saga 1, a split image of Spider-Man and the Scarlet Spider at the bottom, which was taken from the cover of Spider-Man Unlimited number 7 and recoloured. And it's all on the classic black omnibus background. I love how, as they released more of the Clone Saga, they kept the layout so everything matches up perfectly as it sits on the shelf. I don't have Ben Reilly Volume 1 yet, but I have Clone Saga Volume 2, so you can see how they line up nicely, and judging by pictures I've seen, the Ben Reilly books line up as well. The back has the classic layout of all the comics included in the book. This time it's 46 issues comprised of Web of Spider-Man 117 to 125, Amazing Spider-Man 394 to 401, Adjectiveless Spider-Man 51 to 58, Spectacular Spider-Man 217 to 224, issues 7 to 9 of the short-lived Spider-Man Unlimited series, Spider-Man Funeral for an Octopus 1 to 3, Spider-Man The Clone Journal, and material from the Spider-Man Collector's Preview. When you take the dust jacket off, it reveals a wraparound image of Peter and Ben fighting Venom, which is really cool, but also really weird because it seems to be a pin-up by Pedram Shohadai? I'm sorry, I'm butchering that. And this was contained in the Super Spider-Man Super Special that was part of the Planet of the Symbiote storyline, which isn't actually contained in this volume, but is included in Clone Saga Volume 2, so I have no idea what it's doing here. There are plenty of good images inside this volume, so it would have made more sense to use something that was actually printed inside this book. Again, the cover from Spider-Man Unlimited that they used on the spine and recoloured would have been awesome, and there are quite a few images of the Scarlet Spider in that issue that I think are drawn really well, and if they'd been recoloured, they would have made really cool art for the boards, and they would have made sense since they're actually in this book. I have to say this is probably the nicest lying omnibus I have so far. There's pretty much zero gutter loss, which is really impressive for a book that's about 1300 pages. You get the nice eye from the sewn binding, and the book just wants to lie flat so you can enjoy the book at its best. When you open the book up, it has a splash page, a credits page, a recap page, which I always think is useful. Then it's straight into the story, and what a story it is. If you like your 3, 4 or even 5-part stories, you'll love this book. Almost every story has 3 or 4 or 5 parts, with the stories crossing over all the main Spider-Man series that were around back in the 90s. That's actually pretty handy because if you feel like reading a few issues at a time, there's generally going to be a 3 or 4 part story that you can read in one go, then put the book down. They're kind of like chapters in the saga. I've heard people criticise the Clone Saga for its padding, and I have to say, for the first volume at least, I'm not seeing any padding. Having said that, there are 3 more 1300 page volumes, so I may well see it in those books, but for this volume, I don't think there's any padding. This volume is fine. The story starts with a prologue that's made up of a couple of pages from various issues that, along with the introduction, lay down exactly where we're at in the Spider-Verse, and it does a good job of showing Aunt May having a heart attack, the mysterious stranger, that we all know now is Ben Reilly, rushing home to New York to see Aunt May in the hospital, Mary Jane leaving to fix things up with her family so she can be a better wife to Peter or something. Every time I read a Spidey Omni, it always starts after MJ's fucked off somewhere. The JMS Omni started after she fucked off to LA. This one starts after she's fucked off to Pittsburgh. She wants to be a better wife? Stop fucking off, MJ. Jesus. The prologue ends with Peter running into Ben Reilly, which I thought was stupidly done, to be honest, because Ben visits Aunt May in the hospital and sees Peter swinging outside, so he chose to escape by the roof, which is just moronic because everyone knows Peter changes on the roof and walks down. It's his equivalent of Superman's phone box. But they run into each other and that kicks off the entire saga. The first multi-part story is the 4-parter called Power and Responsibility, and it deals with Peter coming face to face with his clone and learning how to deal with him, while also trying to separate himself from Spider-Man and live only as the Spider in order to avoid the pain of losing MJ and Aunt May being on the brink of death. Peter's clone, Ben Reilly, is introduced, and he's come back to see Aunt May before she dies because he's got all of Peter's memories. Eventually, the pair of them are drawn into the Ravencroft Institute to try and free it from the control of a guy called Judas Traveller, and they succeed and part on terms that aren't aggressive but aren't good, and even though Traveller is gone, he does pop up later in the book. Following that, there's another four-parter called The Double, where we see Ben Reilly's life from his first waking moments to how he escapes the Jackal and is lured back in by a clone of Gwen Stacy. Get used to that, there's more than one. All the way up to the fight with Peter, as seen in Amazing Spider-Man number 149, which will be in the 5th omnibus, since the 4th Omni only goes up to issue 142, and this includes Peter throwing his presumed to be dead body into a smokestack to get rid of the evidence, and with Ben surviving and making it out onto the street, breaking down in tears as he realises he's the clone. It was a good way to go back to some Silver Age stuff while also adding something new, and later on in this volume, there's a sequel to this miniseries. Following that is another four-parter called The Exile Returns. I told you there were a lot of four-parters, and this one's quite amusing because we see Ben steal his infamous blue hoodie from the Museum of Natural History in New York. Then he sees Venom on the news and he can't understand why Peter, who has the same morals as him, has allowed Venom to run amok in New York. So Ben dons his Scarlet Spider costume for the first time and rather humorously goes out to deal with Venom, completely unaware of what he's bitten off, and gets the everlasting shit kicked out of him. Fortunately though, Ben shares Peter's scientific talent and he creates his own impact webbing, forcing Venom to swallow it, which causes the symbiote to separate from Eddie Brock, and then the two are put in separate stasis pods and carried away. This series also introduces Kane, although he spends a lot of time watching Ben and Peter before he actually interacts with them. For a nice change, there's a single issue of the short-running Spider-Man Unlimited series, but this is a double-sized issue with two full-length stories and a little half-sized MJ issue. The first is about Ben and how he helps save a homeless guy from a group of street thugs who want to rob him. This homeless guy wants to work, but nobody will give him a chance until the end of the issue, and during the issue, it's quite sad because there's these two store clerks who won't even let him buy stuff with money simply because he's homeless. Ben saves him from the gang, somebody offers him a job, and while it's all sunshine and rainbows right now, he actually dies later on in the volume. If I remember correctly, it's the very next issue of Spider-Man Unlimited. The second story in the issue is about Peter and Cardiac, as Cardiac attacks the head of a car company for deliberately making cars with faulty safety equipment, and Spider-Man stops him. But then the victim is brought to the hospital where Cardiac's alter ego, Dr. Elias Wortham, must operate on him to save his life. He questions his ethical code and the Hippocratic oath he took, and decides to heal him, but goes after him again once he leaves the hospital, only to be thwarted by Spider-Man. But while the two are fighting, the businessman dies and Cardiac escapes, claiming there's no reason for him and Spidey to be fighting anymore since the businessman has already answered to a higher power. The MJ story is only about 10 pages, and it's about how MJ copes when Peter has to rush off to save someone, and the answer is she doesn't cope very well. She seems to go through this cycle of angry, then sad, then resentful, then worried, and when Peter comes home she gives him a big kiss, so it all ends up alright in the end. Following that, there's another four-parter story entitled Back from the Edge, and this is both Peter and MJ's redemption arc to start getting things back on track, with MJ going to see her long-lost sister and father in an effort to be a better family person, and in turn be a better husband to Peter, and Peter comes across Nocturne and Puma and sees what it truly looks like to be separated from oneself, and later on he comes across Daredevil in his super 90s costume. At this point in time, Matt Murdock has allowed everyone to think he's dead, and it's another reflection of what Peter's planning for himself in the future, and I think he sees he's making a mistake. The pair of them track down Owsley and the Vulture, who poisons Peter, and after a fight Peter gets his hands on the cure and takes it, only to discover at the end of the story that the antidote was a fake and turned out to be nothing but tap water. Something that stood out to me in particular was that Bagley has drawn the stairs in Peter's house exactly the same as he did in Ultimate Spider-Man. It's either his drawing or the colouring, but I looked at it and the sense of deja vu was amazing. It's not surprising really since Bagley penciled both, but it was still a pretty cool surprise. Up next is a story called Web of Life, and you guessed it, it's another four-parter. This is quite an interesting one because we see Ben interact with Betty Brant, who of course was Peter's first girlfriend all the way back in the 60s, as well as the revelation that Kane has visions of the future, specifically of people's deaths, and in this case it's Mary Jane's. We also see Peter and Ben sharing dreams of the Jackal's cloning laboratory, which begs the question, how could Peter be dreaming about it if he isn't the clone? But how could Ben be dreaming about it if he isn't the clone either? It's a good plot point, and while we'll see both their minds messed with by the end of the book, this volume doesn't actually have any answers at all. Don't forget there are 3 other volumes. Web of Life also introduces Seward Trainer, an expert in genetics, to help Ben out and test Mary Jane's baby for any genetic anomalies due to Peter's irradiated blood. There's also a new hunter in town, Vladimir Kravenov, aka the Grim Hunter, son of Sergei Kravenov, aka Craven the Hunter. After the suicide of his father in Craven's last hunt, Vladimir has vowed to get revenge on Spider-Man, and unfortunately, he mistakes the Scarlet Spider for the real deal, but Kane wants to kill Ben himself, and the reason why isn't revealed in this volume either. Again, 3 more volumes. The story ends with Kane using his mark, his instant death attack, on the Grim Hunter, ending the story. At some point in the story, we also see some police detectives identifying fingerprints from a murder scene in Salt Lake City, the same murder scene where we were first introduced to Kane earlier in the volume. And of course, this isn't good for Peter because Kane's prints match Peter's, so you know that's not going to go well. Web of Life is followed by Web of Death, which is only a 2-parter. No, I'm just kidding, it's another 4-parter. But really, Web of Life and Web of Death are one story, so the whole thing is an 8-part story. This is an interesting one because Doc Ock actually finds Peter collapsed from the virus the Vulture gave him, and instead of killing him, decides to cure him because while they have their differences and they are enemies, Octavius respects Spider-Man as his strongest foe, as well as respecting his morals. God knows how we got a girl like Stunner though. She seems to be a discount Elektra, kind of psychotic, but nowhere near as interesting because there isn't anywhere near as much depth to her character as Elektra has. Before Octavius can cure Peter properly, his survival instincts kick in, even though he's unconscious, and he escapes and goes home to find Mary Jane has returned, and reveals the big news that she's pregnant. Eventually, Doc Ock makes himself known to Peter so that he can complete the cure, and as the antidote is taking effect, there's a cool scene where Peter hallucinates and he flies away in a dream, floating above New York, and he sees the souls of people he once knew but are now dead, and he sees Aunt May's spirit in the hospital who tells him he needs to go second to the right and straight on till morning, which is of course a Peter Pan reference. So Peter goes and sees Uncle Ben and his parents in what seems to be heaven, but gets yanked back to reality as Doc Ock performs CPR on Peter. Eventually there's a fight with Octavius and Kane, with Kane using his mark on Doc Ock, killing him. The art in this story was some of the best in this volume, with Sal Buscema's breakdowns and Bill Sienkiewicz's finishes being absolutely brilliant, and I thoroughly love the art these two produced together. I said in my review of the Daredevil by Frank Miller Omnibus Companion that I thought Sienkiewicz's was very talented, but that I didn't like the style he used in the Love and War story, and his work in this book just goes to show how talented he really is. Up next is a single issue story for a change. This time it's Spider-Man Unlimited number 8, and it has a pretty cool one-shot story where Mary Jane is having dinner at the top of the World Trade Center and a group of terrorists attack it, and both Peter and Ben hear about it on the news and head out to stop it, and they don't cross paths for the entire issue because they were each in different buildings from each other. This is also the issue which has the death of Rich Gannon, the tramp from the previous issue of Spider-Man Unlimited. One of the terrorists launches a missile and it hits him, and Ben's reaction is just over the top to say the least. He's fall down on his knees, shaking his fists at the sky, yelling, "Why this man? Why this mission?" I get that he felt sorry for the guy, but the way he was reacting, you'd think Aunt May or MJ had died. Part of the reason it was so ridiculous is because Rich Gannon's character had only been introduced in literally the previous issue, so there was no real attachment to the character there. The last page is quite funny because as Peter swings off, you can just see Ben swinging behind him, and he realises for the first time that Peter had been there all along. Funeral for an Octopus is the next story, and this is a 3-part story that seems to have its own numbering, unlike the rest of the issues in this book, which are all issues of other already existing Spider-Man lines like Amazing Spider-Man or Spectacular Spider-Man, so I assume it was meant to be its own mini-event. The story follows Elias Hargrove, Otto Octavius' cousin, after he delivers Octavius' eulogy. After Doc Ock died at the hands of Kane, he left everything to Elias, including his connections to the criminal underworld and the Sinister Six, and his arms and technology, which have been confiscated by the government. He calls a meeting in their old secret hideout, and the remainder of the Sinister Six show up, and they all agree to deliver the arms to Elias in exchange for keeping whatever else they can loot, when they get ambushed by the Scarlet Spider, who's no match for all of them and gets left in a pile of rubble, but not before sticking a spider tracer on Mysterio. Peter catches wind of their plan and fights the Sinister Six at the compound and gets his ass handed to him, so he realises the only way to beat them is to use Doc Ock's arms. So he wears them and kicks the shit out of them, but he can't control the arms for long. Kane comes along and uses his mark on an escaping Mysterio, but it turns out it was just a robot, and Peter gets control of the arms and escapes. It's here that it's revealed that Kane doesn't want Peter to know he exists yet, and the reason why is another thing that's not explained in this volume. Again, 3 more volumes. Be patient. Elias visits the lawyer who gave him the information about Otto, and it turns out to be none other than the real Mysterio, and this entire situation was one of his plans to gain a data disk which has Octavius's knowledge of the players of the underworld on it. And as he attacks Elias, the Scarlet Spider jumps through the window to save him, having woken up from his beating and followed the spider tracer there. Ben lets Elias go with a warning not to do any more bad stuff, and the story ends with Peter thinking that, however misguided Doc Ock was, he still chose to save Peter from death, and any lives he can save from now on are partly due to him, so he vows to find his killer. I thought it was a good story, especially with Mysterio living up to his name in more than just the physical way. Smoke and Mirrors is the next story, and it's another 3-parter and follows both Ben and Peter as they have flash visions of the Jackal in their minds and are drawn to the mountains north of New York. Ben goes first and meets Jack, a little clone of the Jackal, and has to fight the Guardian, another clone of Peter that's gone insane and is covered in these tendrils that wrap around or go under his skin and look remarkably similar to the lines on Kane's costume. As much as Peter tries to ignore the visions of the Jackal, eventually he gives in, and this leads him to the same facility that Ben went to. Kane watches Ben get battered by the Guardian, and Scryer appears, one of the Traveller's minions from the first story in the book that was set in Ravencroft, and he doesn't say much of anything before he disappears. It seems he was just included to ease him back into the book, because the Traveller and his minions come back in the next couple of stories. So Peter arrives and meets Ben, and Jack leads them to a secret facility where the Jackal has been inside a pod that rewrites his DNA to make him stronger than ever before. I loved the Jackal. This is my first time reading anything with him in it, and in this he really does feel like the Joker, specifically the Arkham and 90s cartoon Joker, aka the Mark Hamill Joker. He treats his subordinates like he can only just about tolerate them, and the way he talks to Peter and Ben is very monologue-y. I can just imagine Mark Hamill voicing him. In fact, I did imagine Mark Hamill reading his lines. Bagley's even drawn him to look like the Joker with the big smile and the sinister but still humorous eyes. Jackal plays these awful mind games with Peter and Ben, first revealing a clone of Gwen Stacy, who, thanks to the fact that Mark Bagley penciled this story as well as Ultimate Spider-Man, looks exactly like she did in Ultimate Spider-Man, although a bit less mean because she was a bit of a punk in Ultimate Spider-Man. He has drawn her figure a bit funny though, but it was the 90s, so she's got that classic 90s female comic body which is just completely unrealistic, where the waist is just way too thin and tits that could rival Power Girls. The Jackal continues playing his games with the Parkers by telling one that he's the original and that the other one is the clone, and then saying the exact same thing to the other Parker. He even tells them neither of them are the original, leaving both of them in total confusion. Kane watches the fight, and in turn he's watched by Scryer. Gwen develops the same kind of lines as Kane and the Guardian and eventually just melts onto the floor, with Jack explaining that it's clone degeneration, unstable clones that age too quickly on a cellular level and eventually degenerate. The Jackal escapes, and Jack, knowing he's suffering from the same clone degeneration as Gwen, and having his requests of the Jackal curing him being ignored all the time, seeing the clone of Gwen die and seeing it in his future, shows Peter and Ben the way out, and the comic ends with one pod left in the rubble, still intact, with no clue what's inside. Players and Pawns is a 2-parter that follows immediately from the events in Smoke and Mirrors, this time from the point of view of Kane, who enters the wreckage of the facility to see the unknown pod opening and another Peter Parker walking out. Kane confronts the Jackal, but he refuses to say who the real Peter is. Scryer pops up again and talks to the Jackal, and it seems they know each other, as well as the Jackal knowing who the Traveller is, although that's yet another thing that's not explained in this volume. Kane has another vision of Mary Jane dying, then reveals himself to Peter for the first time, giving him a folder that he claims has proof that Peter is the original, while the Jackal follows Ben to Midtown High, where we see a blast from the past, none other than Flash Thompson, who's not Ginger anymore by the way, no longer a school bully and teaching gym. The Jackal then releases these creatures he's created by genetically splicing together DNA from all sorts of different creatures, and to his credit, Flash gets the kids out without any concern for his own safety, showing just how much he's grown since his days at Midtown High, and it was nice to see. Ben jumps into action and defeats the Jackal, who's taken into custody, and Jack finally dies of clone degeneration, passing on a disc to Ben that he says has proof that he's the real Parker, which directly contradicts what Kane told Peter. Clearly, this is more of the Jackal's mind games, and Ben doesn't fall for it. He's got used to being the clone and accepted his life as Ben Reilly, so he throws the disc into the river and swings off into the sunset. I liked this. I thought it was nice that Ben made the choice for himself rather than relying on the Jackal to define him the way Peter has been. Across town, in the hospital, Aunt May finally wakes up, and the story ends with the Peter Parker that came out of the pod in the cloning facility walking the streets, clueless as to who he is and what he is, when he gets jumped by a gang and easily defeats them with his spider abilities, even though he didn't mean to, and didn't even know he had them, prompting him to ask, what is he? Amazing Spider-Man 400 is a single-issue story, although it's a bumper special because not only is 400 a milestone worth celebrating in comics, but something very big happens in this issue. Peter goes to see Aunt May now that she's awake, and she can tell just by looking at MJ that she's pregnant, and she's happy for both of them, and insists on going home against medical advice. The Jackal, locked up in Ravencroft, is doing his best impression of a ranting prisoner, but then reveals he's allowed himself to be captured because he's exactly where he wants to be. Ben visits Peter and they go outside in their costumes to have a conversation, and I did wonder what the neighbours must have thought about two Spider-Men just chilling in the Parker's back garden, but Ben tells Peter he's leaving now that the Jackal's gone, and that Peter can have a real shot at happiness with Aunt May feeling better and MJ pregnant. For the first time ever, it seems Peter's okay with Ben, and they shake hands and Ben swings away. Across the streets, one of the Traveller's minions is watching them and reporting everything to him. We see the Peter Parker from the pod coming to terms with his powers, then the real Peter takes Aunt May to the top of the Empire State Building, where she tells Peter she's known for a long time that he's really Spider-Man, and that Uncle Ben would be proud of him when disaster strikes and Aunt May seems to grow weak or have another heart attack or something, because she insisted on leaving the hospital without more tests, so Peter takes her home to bed, and with MJ and Aunt Anna in the room and Ben watching from outside, Peter tells her second to the right and straight on till morning, and Aunt May passes away peacefully. It was a sad moment, and I think it had been set up well, but don't worry, that old bird is like a broken record. I couldn't even count the amount of times she'd revealed she knows Peter's secret then popped her clogs. After she dies, there are quite a few pages that are completely speechless, and this was great because it allowed Bagley to tell the story through the visuals alone, and we see everyone crying, a shooting star, and eventually the burial of Aunt May. Peter and MJ leave, and Ben appears and drops a rose on Aunt May's grave, and we see her tombstone says, "May Parker, she taught us to love," and right next to it is Uncle Ben's, which says, "Ben Parker, he was loved." I thought it was a nice touch linking their tombstones with words like that, and the whole death and funeral was done really well. Of course, nobody had been thinking about the Parker luck, which we all know is rotten, and once Peter and MJ get home from the funeral, the detective that had been investigating the Salt Lake City murders that were actually committed by Kane in his introduction scene, knocks on the door and arrests Peter for murder and takes Peter away in handcuffs, and the last thing he sees as he looks out of the car is Ben Reilly. When it rains it pours, right? Ben Reilly introduces himself to Mary Jane, announcing it was time they talked, and takes off his mask, revealing a face identical to Peter's. That's it for issue 400. I really liked this issue. It packed a lot in for how long the comic was, and finally brought the detective and murder storyline to the front of the comic. Aftershock is a two-part story contained in Adjective List Spider-Man 57 and Spectacular Spider-Man 223, and continues immediately where the last issue ended. And the first thing I noticed was John Romita Jr. drew the first issue with Sal Buscema and Bill Sienkiewicz doing the second issue, and I loved Romita's art in this. I love when he draws Spider-Man, especially the 90s stuff. This issue is drawn well, but there's another story later where I think he really outdoes himself. It turns out J. Jonah Jameson, believe it or not, has a heart, because while he distances himself and the Bugle from Peter because of the murder charges, he secretly hired an expensive lawyer for him. Speaking of the Jamesons, we see in this book, and in the first story of this volume actually, that John Jameson, ever the guy Marvel have no idea what to do with, has become head of security at Ravencroft Institution for some reason. I don't really care about it, he's a pointless character, and I can't even remember the last time he was in a comic. Wasn't he the astronaut in the first or second issue of Spider-Man? How'd you go from astronaut to security guard to mental institution? His character is fine in this, it's just John Jameson overall, over the years, it's just pointless. They created him to be Jonah's son and they had no idea what to do with him, and they never have. Kane uses his mark on the detective without killing him to prove that Peter didn't kill those people because they all had Kane's mark, and I still have no idea what he really wants with Peter. And when Ben talks to MJ and she throws him out, Traveller attacks her to read her mind about Peter, and Ben saves her, and this makes MJ change her mind about him and agrees to talk to him as long as he keeps his mask on. But when he admits to not competing for Peter's life anymore, she starts to accept him and takes off his mask herself, eventually calling him Uncle. The Jackal, more like the Joker than ever, sings the psychotic version of the Barney the Dinosaur song, and the reason he wanted to be in Ravencroft was to take back the carrion virus, which Shriek had absorbed in Amazing Spider-Man 393, the issue right before the start of this volume, because it turns out the Jackal is the creator of the carrion virus, and the carrion virus works in the same way as clone degeneration. The end of the story shows the Pod Peter clone at the graveyard, and he breaks down the same way Ben did in the Clone Chronicles, but in the opposite way. He thinks he's the real Peter Parker. Amazing Spider-Man 400, Adjectiveless Spider-Man 57, and Spectacular Spider-Man 223 all had short stories in the back of them. The first called The Morning After, which is an Aunt May story, and the rest form a three-part story called The Parker Legacy. The Aunt May story is only about 5 pages long and does a good job of showing Aunt May's grief over losing Uncle Ben and how Peter was tempted to run away, but realised he needed to be responsible and stay to support Aunt May both financially and emotionally, and even though it was short, I quite liked it. At first it may seem like this has nothing to do with the Clone Saga other than the fact it was printed in the back of a clone comic, but Ben has these memories too, and it ties in with his sense of responsibility and how he acts throughout these books. The Parker Legacy continues the story from exactly the moment the double ended earlier in this volume, and something I like about this is that this is the other story I was talking about that's drawn by John Romita Jr., and he's really outdone himself here. This is proper Man Without Fear levels of awesomeness from JRJR. I also like how on the very first page it says it's been 5 years since the original clone story in issue 142. So between 1975 and 1995, we now know for a fact that 5 years have elapsed in the comics, which is a good inclusion for anyone who cares about that stuff. Some people don't, some people do. It's nice that it's been included. Ben goes to Peter's house to take some clothes Peter was going to give to charity and leaves town, and on his journey he learns to stop helping people and stop being Spider-Man. He goes on a bit of a bender because of his grief and takes it out on a bartender and a guy called Clifford, really belittling him, and when he goes to have a go at him some more, he finds him with a gun in his mouth because of the combination of his wife and kids leaving him and Ben ridiculing him, when Ben realises they have similar situations because they both have a fresh start for the future. The story ends with Ben coming to terms with his new life, and as his bus drives away, Clifford asks him his name, and I love how they've done it, so you can see that he says Ben Reilly, but the sound of the bus drowns it out. I thought that was a really nice touch, and I think this was a really good mini-series, and the art and the story were top-notch. The Mark of Cain is the last multi-part story in this volume and brings an end to the main events of the book in 5 issues. Cain kidnaps MJ and takes her to the sewers to keep her safe from his visions, and they stumble into the Peter from the pod, and MJ escapes while Cain and Pod Peter are fighting. Bagley's art in issue 2 again really reminds me of Ultimate Spider-Man when Peter from the pod is swinging across the city. Chakra, one of Judas Traveller's minions, once again appears to Peter just like she did all the way back at the beginning of the book, this time to warn him that MJ is in danger. So Peter breaks out of prison and Traveller orders Chakra to teleport Peter to the mainland, and we see an interesting conversation between Traveller and Scryer where we find out they've been friends for centuries. Pod Peter invades Peter and MJ's home dressed as Spider-Man in an attempt to convince MJ that he's the original, but Cain turns up and knocks him out and takes MJ back to the sewers. So Peter puts on his black costume because it's all the Spidey gear he's got left, and MJ activates a tracker so Peter can find her. So he heads to the sewers, which leads to a massive fight between Peter, Ben, Cain and Pod Peter, who it turns out is a genetically modified assassin that can morph and grow, and he's been mentally conditioned to believe he's the real Peter, and that the only way to be returned to normal is by killing every other Peter. And I have to say, Buscema and Sinkowitz's art when Pod Peter goes insane is seriously awesome. I really can't decide in this book who my favourite artist is. Bagley, John Romita Jr. or Buscema and Sinkowitz. It's a tough call, they all do such a good job. Peter, Ben and Cain beat Pod Peter, and to show he's not guilty, Ben volunteers to take Peter's place in prison, giving him a chance to find the real killer and prove his innocence. The Sinister Six, or 7 if you're counting, go hunting for Cain after he took out Robo, Mysterio and Electro earlier, and Cain dresses up in Pod Peter's costume to fool them and catch them by surprise, and Trainer gives MJ some bad news about her baby, but we don't know what it is yet. I have to wait for volume 2. The final story is called Lives Unlimited, and it's a single issue story, but it's a bumper issue. It's a good story, but a bit of a weird one because Peter, now dressed as the Scarlet Spider for some reason, tries to unravel Miles Warren's past, and he comes across a clone of both Warren and Gwen living together. I get that Peter and Ben swapped places at the end of the last story, but I don't see why Peter can't still dress as Spider-Man. The world doesn't know they've swapped places, so it seems pointless to me. The clones of Gwen and Miles seem to know they're clones, and by the end of the issue, the clone degeneration has got them. But in a twisted way, it seems the real Jackal wanted to know that somehow, in some way, there was a version of himself and Gwen that ended up together. It worked because it shows just how twisted the Jackal's mind is, because even though that will never be his life, he just wants to know it exists in some way. MJ has a nice moment where she confides in Felicia about Ben, and as Peter leaves the home of the Miles and Gwen clones, he's followed by the Green Goblin, who kidnaps Gwen from the car she's escaping in on the bridge, and, you know, what else does the Green Goblin do? Predictably, he throws her off it. It's the second omnibus in a row I've read where Peter's had to relive this nightmare. The last one was the Straczynski omnibus that had the Sins Past story, where Gwen and Norman's son threw his sister, who looks identical to Gwen, off the bridge. That's obviously set in the future, so this story came first, but it was still good, and it was good here. This time Peter saves Gwen by being very careful not to snag her too hard, because it was actually Peter that killed Gwen in the night Gwen Stacy died. It's been explained in the comics and confirmed by the writers that it wasn't the fall that killed her, it was the sudden change in velocity that caused her neck to snap when Peter snagged her with his web and pulled on her. Canonically, Peter Parker killed Gwen Stacy by accident, not the Green Goblin. Peter's learned his lesson about that though, and he saves the clone of Gwen. After the bridge fight, we see the Goblin talking about how he missed Uncle B at the Daily Bugle, which makes me wonder if he really is Ben Urich's nephew, or this is just a ploy to fool the reader, and how and where whoever it is got the Goblin gear. At the end of the story, there's a flashback of how the cloned Miles and Gwen ended up married, and the most notable thing about it is that there are a few books called Webs, and they all have pictures of Spider-Man on the front, paying homage to Todd McFarlane, which is pretty cool. And that's pretty much it for the comics in Clone Saga Volume 1. There is one more issue called The Clone Journal, but it's not really relevant, it just retells everything that's been in the saga so far, so basically everything that's contained in this book was squashed down to like a 30-page comic or something. So if you read this volume, it's completely pointless, but I can see why it's been included. It was connected to the Clone Saga, it was released in the 90s, and I can see why it was released originally. It would have been a nightmare trying to get into Spider-Man at the end of this book, so an issue that catches up new readers is a really good idea. I don't know who drew the last page with Ben web swinging, but the pose and the style, the attention to detail, everything looks like Todd McFarlane's work, except he's not listed as one of the pencilers. Maybe they just missed his name out, or somebody else draws exactly like him. At the beginning of the book, I said there were plenty of other images they could have used on the cover, and I've changed my mind. This is the image they should have used. Cut out all the other stuff, just have the Scarlet Spider and his webbing, stick that on the cover with a white background, and it would look amazing. There's a collector's preview which has news about what at the time was upcoming Spidey events and info about all the creators and a few sketch designs, and the back of the book has some pin-ups, profiles, covers and a few more sketches and the covers for the trades which have all been recoloured, and that's it for Clone Saga Volume 1. Overall, I have to say I loved this volume. 1300 pages. That's huge. It took me a while to get through it, to be honest, but I loved it, and even though I'm the kind of person that likes to read 1 or 2 issues at a time, having most of the stories as either 3 or 4 parters or as a single bumper issue really did help me get through it quicker. I thought the story was excellent, with the truth of who the original Peter is never actually being revealed in this volume, and constantly making me wonder as I read it, and the art was top notch, and I feel so incredibly lucky that this volume was drawn by some of my favourite artists. Man Without Fear era JRJR, Bagley, whose style barely changed in Ultimate Spider-Man, and the fantastic double team Sal Buscema and Bill Sienkiewicz all added their own feel to the comics they worked on, but they were all really on their games when they did this, and the art is 10 out of 10 throughout the entire book. Really amazing. I have Volume 2, I can't wait to read it, although I may read the Frank Miller and Klaus Janson Daredevil Omnibus first, and I'm hoping to get Ben Reilly Volume 1 in May, so hopefully by the time Ben Reilly Volume 2 comes out in July, I'll have caught up. I've never read the Clone Saga before, and I really enjoyed this book. Will it lose track of the main plot and meander off into nonsense? I don't know, but most people think so. I'll have to read volume 2 so I can find out and let you know.